I'm so pleased you're able to join us this afternoon. My name is Anne-Rose Kitagawa. I'm the Chief Curator of Collections and Asian Art at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. I'd like to begin today's program, Myriad Treasures, Highlights of Traditional and Contemporary Chinese Art from the new Soaring Gallery, by acknowledging that the University of Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Southern Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in western Oregon. Today, their descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. I'd like to continue with thanks to my distinguished academic colleague, Ina Asim, Associate Professor of Chinese History in the Department of History at UO, whose deep knowledge of and great passion for Chinese material culture is infectious in the best possible ways. Also to the very talented and dedicated JSMA staff whose expertise and hard work resulted in this ambitious renovation and reinstallation of our Grand Chinese Gallery. These include, but are not limited to, Associate Director Kurt Neugebauer, who designed the renovated space, Chief Preparator Joey Capadona and his able team of preparators, Mark O'Hara, Beth Robinson Hartpence, Anthony Edwards, Noah Green, and Sam Rigglesworth, and soaring intern Kit McSweeney, graphic design wizard Mike Bragg, our great collections management team headed by Chris White, and our photographer Jonathan Smith, whose beautiful images will be the focus of today's presentation. Most importantly, we're deeply indebted to Betty Soaring and other generous anonymous donors, whose largesse has made it possible to upgrade our space to match the precious Chinese art that it showcases. So with that, I think we will begin with the PowerPoint presentation. So forgive me a moment. And here we go. Fabulous. So hopefully you can see on the screen the title slide. The Betty and John Soaring Gallery of Chinese Art at the University of Oregon's Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art has recently undergone a long-awaited renovation. Generous donors provided support to enhance the space to align better with the high quality of the collection. Myriad Treasures, the inaugural installation in the newly refurbished gallery, features 113 objects spanning 4 millennia of Chinese history from the museum's legacy collection, along with some exciting recent acquisitions. The University of Oregon Museum of Art, as the JSMA was called originally, was founded through the efforts of Asian art collector Gertrude Bass Warner. Gertrude Bass was born into a prominent Chicago family and educated in France and at Vassar College in New York, where she studied art and became an accomplished amateur photographer. In 1904, after a decade after divorcing her first husband, she traveled to Asia to visit her brother, who was there as a journalist covering the Russo-Japanese War. In China, she met Major Murray Warner, an MIT-trained engineer employed by the American Trading Company. The couple soon married and established their home in Shanghai and a houseboat on the Yangtze River. The Warners were stimulated by their surroundings and traveled widely to learn about various Asian artistic, literary, cultural, and religious traditions. Mrs. Warner documented their adventures by collecting professional photographs, which she supplemented with pictures of her own. She also began to amass a collection of Chinese and Japanese and later Korean works of remarkable quality, depth, and complexity, focusing on well-established artistic categories, but delving deeper when particular themes piqued her interest. For example, she became fascinated with sericulture, or silk production, which stimulated her to collect over 450 Chinese silk garments and hangings, representing many styles and techniques, and even to experiment with silkworm cultivation. What you see at the left are some of her own silkworms and the cocoons they produced in her attic in Shanghai. Living in China, she learned to appreciate native art forms, not just those created for export. In 1909, the Warners relocated to San Francisco, and after her husband's death in 1920, Gertrude Bass Warner moved to Eugene, where her son Samuel Bass Warner was a professor of law at the law school at the University of Oregon. In 1922, when UO president Prince Lucian Campbell agreed to raise funds to build an academic art museum, Mrs. Warner donated more than 3,700 Asian objects to the state in her husband's memory to establish the University of Oregon Museum of Art. What you see here is an image of selections from the Murray Warner collection installed in Gerlinger Hall before the museum was built. Mrs. Warner devoted the next 30 years to fundraising for. Here you see a picture of people fundraising on the ground that eventually housed the museum, designing and building the museum, expanding its collection, and serving as its founding director. This is the original design for the museum, and you'll see, if those of you who are familiar with it, that it doesn't look exactly the way the museum looks now, which we'll discuss in just a moment. So with these objectives in mind, Mrs. Warner traversed the globe, visiting museums and consulting with experts in order to create a world-class institution demonstrating the highest standards of exhibition and preservation. One result of her labors was a heightened sense of awareness of the potential damage caused by light exposure and fluctuating climate. To avoid these pitfalls, Warner asked architect Ellis F. Lawrence to design a fireproof, windowless, artificially ventilated building made of concrete clad in brick, which is why you see no windows on the front of the facade as you saw in the original design. As a Christian Scientist, Mrs. Warner aspired to promote cross-cultural understanding with the goal of achieving world peace. Deeply distressed by the cruelties of war she witnessed during her travels, she became a committed peace activist. Her museum's mission stated its ambition to, quote, illustrate the customs, costumes, and manners of the Chinese and Japanese people, their literature, philosophy, religion, arts, and crafts, for the purpose of aiding as far as possible the prevention of war, end quote. She held progressive views on a variety of subjects. For example, she was disappointed with the social disparities she observed in China, where she and her husband often rode in third-class coaches rather than the first-class transportation reserved for wealthy foreigners. She had no patience for collectors who craved exotic art but had no curiosity about the people who produced it. She was concerned that UO students were inattentive to the foreigners with whom they came in contact, and aspired to teach them the, quote, understanding of the brotherhood of man, all children of one father, end quote. In addition to her work at the museum, Warner amassed a collection of 5,000 glass lantern slides of Chinese and Japanese subjects, purchased Asian books for the library, provided support for the nascent Asian Studies program, and gave grants for American students to go to Asia and for Asian students to come to UO. When the University of Oregon Museum of Art opened to the public in 1933, it focused almost exclusively on Asian art. Its restrained brick facade bore biblical quotations from Proverbs and Psalms, along with inscriptions representing the parallel wisdoms of Asia and the West. Here on the left, a quotation from Lao Tzu, on the right, a quotation from Plato. The new museum featured well-appointed small and medium-sized Japanese and Korean rooms, flanking a grandiose central gallery filled with Chinese treasures and anchored at either end by ornately decorated thrones inside a large glass display case. Dubbed the Throne Room, this Chinese gallery was specifically designed to accommodate Gertrude Bess Warner's largest Chinese textiles, which include, as you see on the left, a 10-foot tall, 13-foot wide imperial bed curtain, and on the right, in this slide, a 15-foot tapestry weave hanging of Taoist immortals, flanked by a pair of 13-foot gold-wrapped silk carpets. For over 80 years, the Warner Collection has provided ample inspiration and research opportunities for generations of staff, students, faculty, scholars, and museum visitors. Likewise, Mrs. Warner's idealism and generosity of spirit have inspired subsequent benefactors, such as Betty Soring, who endowed the Chinese Gallery with her husband in the early 2000s and provided additional support for its recent renovation, and Portland philanthropist Jordan Schnitzer, in whose honor the museum was renamed after its 2002 through 2005 expansion. Over time, minor modifications have been made to the Chinese gallery, but its imposing size precluded a major overhaul. The cumulative damage of over 80 years of successive installations rendered the horsehair plaster walls increasingly difficult to work with. The only illumination, which you see in the slide at upper left, was provided by lights mounted in the coved glass coffered ceiling 25 feet above the gallery floor, allowing no flexibility in terms of angle or placement. The carpet was worn and in need of replacement. In addition, the scale of the largest Chinese textiles and the combined size and darkened state of many of the Chinese paintings presented significant display challenges, since standard size sheets of acrylic glazing are too small to cover such large works and create distracting reflections, and since oversized sheets of non-glare glazing are prohibitively expensive. For this reason, a number of the museum's most important Chinese objects were deemed too large or too difficult to safely and attractively display. So this is from perhaps the late 1960s, early 1970s. And here, the more recent renovation at the time that the museum was renamed, around 2005. So in 2018, the decision was made to renovate the JSMA's Soaring Gallery. After a successful fundraising campaign, the respective floor, wall, case, and lightwork modifications were implemented. A dark gray color scheme was chosen and coordinating carpet installed. The gallery walls were painted, and 5 sturdy 12-foot feature walls were erected at key focal points, which you see here along this side, at this end, and along this end. You can't really see them. New track lighting was suspended 10 feet below the coffered ceiling, affording easier access and greater aesthetic control of lighting. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of the renovation was the installation of 2 large state-of-the-art display cases with integrated LED lighting and non-reflective glass that can graciously accommodate all of the museum's largest Chinese paintings or three-dimensional objects on pedestals and shelves. Here you see the design on the left and the cases just after installation. These were designed by, again, by Kurt Neugebauer of the museum. So, after the renovation was completed, Myriad Treasures was installed in the newly refurbished gallery. The exhibition opened to the public in February 2020, but closed 1 month later due to the pandemic. Barred from entering the building, museum staff transitioned to producing original exhibition-related digital content in order to address the changing curricular needs of faculty and students. At the end of this event, we will screen the Chinese language minute exhibit video about the Soaring Gallery. So this exhibition reopened last month when the museum resumed socially distanced in-person visits, and unfortunately closed again with the closure of the museum due to the higher statistics of COVID-19 in the area. So depending upon when you screen this presentation, perhaps the museum, I hope, will be open again. So now I thought we would do the best that we can under the circumstances, which is take a quick view through Matterport, a new software. So this is one of our new digital resources, and we were able to create this thanks to a grant from Art Bridges. So it uses Matterport virtual exhibition software. And what we'll do is take a digital walk through the Soaring Gallery together, pointing out some aspects of the renovation and reinstallation, after which we'll return to PowerPoint in order to discuss a few specific works of art with Professor Asim. So with that, let me switch to Matterport. And this is about to become public as well for the general public. And what the software allows you to do is essentially virtually move through the space. So wherever you see a circle on the ground is a place where a camera was placed and took panoramic shots around the gallery, which are then pieced together to make a view so that you have the illusion of walking through the space. And as you can see, if I move slowly, I can pan across the space of the gallery and give you a sense of the way that it looks. And I had mentioned the lights, so they don't really show up in other pictures, but here you can see lighting tracks suspended 10 feet below the ceiling, which actually affords a great deal more flexibility in terms of lighting. Matterport also allows you to zoom in. So I think if I try and do this slowly without making anyone nauseous, you can see a certain amount of detail even with these Matterport images taken from a certain distance away. And if I back away again from the case, I can continue turning through the gallery. So let me continue moving along in this direction. And one can aim from one of these circles to another. So if I click on that circle, all of a sudden I am transported to that spot, and I can see areas where we have juxtaposed a number of works of art. So these 3 large-scale works we'll discuss later. And one can even move through the space. Let's see. hope this isn't too nauseating. um, One can again look with some detail at some of these objects. That's about as close as I can get, but I can move through the space and get to the other side and see other objects. And in fact, work our way down towards some of the Chinese textiles that are one of the great glories of Gertrude Bess Warner's collection. So I will focus on one in particular that we will look at also in PowerPoint, which is this wonderful woman's vest, and above it, a terrific military banner. And again, using Matterport, one can get to a certain level of acuity. But I think in PowerPoint, we have a few detailed slides that will allow you to really appreciate some of the details of some of these textiles. As you look down towards the end of the gallery, you can see our magnificent jade pagoda, and we can end up by looking at this incredible contemporary work of art by the artist Liu Hong, juxtaposed with some of our wonderful large-scale Chinese paintings, which you can really admire and see for the first time within these cases. So we strategically designed the cases to have dark walls so that the paintings themselves don't end up looking so dark. And we'll also discuss some of the ceramics that are in this case. So as we move past the pagoda and towards some of those ceramics, I think for the actual presentation, we will go more or less chronologically, starting with this wonderful Neolithic vessel, and we'll also discuss some of the treasures that are inside of the Chinese treasure wall and some of the bronzes that are in this case. So with that, I think I will switch out of Matterport and back to PowerPoint and invite Professor Asim to share in this discussion. So, as I had mentioned, I thought we might start with this wonderful Neolithic vessel.
It's a beautiful vessel, the oldest item in the Chinese collection, maybe in the museum, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
And as our audience will see, it's decorated sort of halfway down because this is a storage vessel that was set into the ground so that it wouldn't tip over and would be stable. And we know from archaeological excavations where in the house these vessels were actually stored. However, even if only half decorated, the decoration is very intricate, and these kinds of vessels usually had a geometric pattern or geometric patterns. Actually, the diversity is quite stunning.
So one of the interesting things about working with faculty colleagues is that they broaden your horizons. And in the past, Professor Seam had planned a Chinese Foodways conference for which we thought it might made sense to put out a number of our bronze vessels from China. The earliest of these vessels is very early indeed, from the earliest historical period with written documentation, what you see on the left from the Shang Dynasty, whereas some of the later pieces are really quite recent. So across the span of this case, one covers multiple millennia. This made me nervous as an art historian because art historians tend to separate these things and silo them, whereas Professor Seam very rightly pointed out, what's interesting is the continuity, and people can read the labels. So I thought that helped broaden my horizon, and I do think it's exciting to see them together.
And it's also very interesting for the students to see that a material like bronze that was so highly revered in China was used and has been used throughout imperial times. So from the Shang dynasty all the way to the Qing dynasty, to the last imperial dynasty, bronze didn't lose its appeal for people who commissioned vessels, whether they were in the imperial collection or whether they were in private collections. And you also see the continuity in shape. So I would like to point out to our audience the vessel on the very far left, the oldest bronze vessel here on the slide from the Shang Dynasty, and the vessel that is in the center, the gu, a ritual wine vessel. And you will see in further slides how these shapes are reused with a different decor, but with the allusion to these old vessels from times when this shape was invented. I have to say, though, that the Gu vessel from the Song Dynasty is already an allusion to similar vessels from the Zhou Dynasty from a much earlier time. So in the Song Dynasty, we have a period of antiquarianism, people collecting objects from antiquity, archaism, was sort of the movement among the collectors who really uh, revered antiquity, and also in terms of the imperial collection drew legitimacy from ancient art.
So this
Oh,
is
what
an
a
image of the treasure wall that has a number of these vessels in it, and we took a great deal of joy in installing them near that bronze case so that people could make these comparisons.
Yeah, it's always interesting for the students to find the equivalent. Um, when I say, look at the Jia vessel from the Shang Dynasty, where do you find it in the treasure wall? And here we make it easy. Thanks to Anne Rose's selection, you see that this shape has been chosen again in the Qing Dynasty to make a Jia vessel, but this time not in bronze, but in porcelain with emai. And again, an example of archaism, you see on the left side the tripod from the Zhou Dynasty, the old model, and on the right side a new take, a modern take in the eyes of Emperor Tianlong at his time, of this kind of ding, this kind of tripod in rock crystal, a material that he loved for its transparency and purity. And again, this is what we mentioned initially. You see the repetition of the shape, but with a different decor and in different materials. So the gu on the left is the already antiquarian Song Dynasty vessel, and then you see two examples in jade and in cloisonné from the Qing Dynasty. Our dear friends, two ferocious tomb guardians who were placed inside of the tomb. These kinds of mythical creatures, one with a beast's head, one with a human face, were placed inside of tombs. They were produced in series for tomb owners or for the descendants of a deceased person who were equipping the tomb for their deceased family member, and they were supposed to ward off evil spirits. They're a little static. You will also find very dynamically aggressive looking and acting tomb guardians that are made in series and decorated with a glaze that points them to the Tang Dynasty, just like these two. They were then made already under the influence of Buddhism. Those of you who were in China and have visited Buddhist temples may have seen the temple guardians that are very dynamic in their expression. And so that was copied by artists and artisans who made tomb figurines.
So we have a wonderful display of brown and black Chinese ceramics associated with tea. And I think we have one detail of one of the vessels, the one in the center that you see here, that has the impression of a leaf on the interior, made by putting an actual leaf into the vessel in the kiln before firing. During firing, of course, the leaf burnt, but it left its trace inside. And one can imagine drinking tea from this bowl and being left with the impression of the tea leaf, a really beautiful kind of lyrical association.
And highly beloved with this dark glaze, so much so that when monks brought it to Japan, that it created a stir in Japan and a further development of vessels in Japanese tea drinking, um, for the tea ceremony, but also for tea drinking habits. This is a beloved piece in the collection, and we're very grateful for to the um, donors who gave this to the museum collection, because it shows on one side a motif that is highly cherished, a tiger, but it's kind of tame the way it is uh, positioned here. And this is a pillow, and you will say a ceramic pillow, that is hard. But if you then imagine that you would like to um, take a nap and rest your neck and head on a cooling surface in the hot summer in China, and if you had a very elaborate hairdo that you didn't want to undo and redo, then you can see that this was actually very inviting. And while your dreams were protected by this ferocious tiger, you also had allusions to a very lyrical dream, maybe, in the painting, in the decor on the back of the tiger. Tianlong, Emperor Tianlong, was a lover of glass. He loved not only crystal, rock crystal, but he loved glass for its transparency, its purity, and he loved also the clear colors. All the colors you see here, and also at times black. So this is probably an aesthetic that he enjoyed for, as I said, the purity, but also because it has allusions to both Taoism and uh, Buddhism. The transformation that has to happen in order to produce glass from its original materials is something that very much alludes to the alchemical process that Taoist um, scientists, if you want to call them that way, uh, experimented with, and the purity of the material. And then also the decor in certain examples also allude to his Buddhist inclinations.
And these also, I think, bespeak a certain amount of trade relationships, in that I believe that some of the technology was coming directly from Europe at the time.
Yeah, it was Kilian Stumpf from Würzburg, the Jesuit father, who actually introduced glass technology, and together with two French fathers, Jesuit fathers, who helped the Kangxi Emperor, to the grandfather of Tianlong, to overcome a severe malaria attack. They were given a space very close to the imperial city. Actually, if you have been to Beijing, it's just west of Beihai Park, and they were given a residence, and right next to the residence they installed a glass making workshop and oversaw the production. They invited craftsmen from Guangzhou to come, and then received the orders, the commissions from the emperors, from Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, and produced glass in this glass workshop. So there were several generations of Jesuit fathers involved with glass production, and just different from very many other technologies that China was far ahead of everybody else in producing. Glass was something that they highly admired, but where the technology came from the West, from Italy and Persia. Here,
No.
another example.
And here we have an example of overglaze enamel vessels. So it's no coincidence that we use the word China to talk about fine ceramics, because the Chinese have been making them as long as longer and as well and better than any other culture. So here you have an example of an object that had to be fired twice. So first, in terms of ceramics, you have earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain as three successively more refined types of ceramics. This is, of course, porcelain, the highest fire using the most refined materials. And it uses an underglaze cobalt to make that beautiful blue color that was fired at a high temperature. However, in order to achieve that beautiful, luminous, sunny yellow color, one had to apply enamel that had to be fired at a lower temperature, which is why it had to be fired twice. And in fact, I think we have a detail where you can kind of see how they've filled in the edges around the blue and white motifs with the yellow, and you get a sense of how glorious the design is on the surface of this vessel.
And that's, of course, the imperial color.
Mm. So, moving ahead, we're very fortunate Gertrude Best Warner was able to collect a couple of examples of imperial calligraphy. And these are enormous inscriptions actually written by an emperor, in this case, the Emperor Yongjung. And to a certain extent, our collection, especially in the Myriad Treasures installation, is kind of a story of three emperors. So, there's the Emperor Kangxi, the grandfather, the Emperor Yongjung, the father, and then the son or grandson, who we've talked about a couple of times now, Qianlong. So Professor Asim can tell you a little bit more about Emperor Yongzheng's character, but his quotation, "honesty and diligence enrich the country," seem like words to live by.
Yeah, and it seems that he took this very seriously. He is known, different from his grandfather, as not so fond of traveling. He, just like his grandfather, whom, or like his father, I should say, he worked a lot. He was very concentrated in his studies, and he practiced calligraphy, was a very erudite person. His son, then, Kangxi's grandson, Qianlong, was a little, or is said to be of a similar interest, wide interest, like his grandfather. He also traveled a lot and engaged in art collection way beyond the uh, more modest attempts and intentions of his father, I should carefully say.
So, in addition to imperial calligraphy, there you see it in situ in the gallery, we also have a number of really splendid court textiles. And this gives you a sense of the central display. But as I had mentioned, Gertrude Best Warner has over 450 such examples in the collection. And so choosing was really a joy. This is the Manchu woman's formal court vest and collar that I had very quickly scrolled toward in our Matterport tour. And in fact, when you get closer, you can see that not only is this enlivened with embroidery, but also with something called couching, where you take silk threads and wrap them with gold or silver, in this case gold, and then tack those down onto the surface to make not just the color, but also kind of three-dimensional forms, as you see on the scales of the five-clawed dragon here. And within status garments, as they are called, one can tell the rank of the person who was to wear a garment by the number of claws on a single paw of the dragon. So in this case, a five-clawed dragon meant it was intended for the emperor or the empress.
And we see more than just the status. In addition to the status, we see also auspicious iconography and iconography from Buddhism. So the waves next to Mount Sumeru, and then we see the swastika and the conch shell, all alluding to Buddhism, and then finally the bat that is a an auspicious symbol for good luck.
And there are other wonderful examples, just a few of which I present here. And in addition, these wonderful tiger banners.
Yeah, the tiger banners are so beautiful because they are actually double-sided, double-faced embroidery adorns these banners so that in a military procession, in a parade, when they were carried through the onlooking audience, both sides would indicate this the battalion following it. And it's a very difficult work to do because with the opaque green or yellow silk, the person, the embroidering artist, could not see the back side, but they, with a sure hand, um, executed these masterpieces. And of course, these were very well versed craftspeople who were commissioned to embroider something like this. If we look at the details, you can see here how dense the stitches are and what great care had been taken to even show shades in the reds of the tongue and the colors of the eyes. It's amazing. If you go to Suzhou today and you see people working in a studio who create double-faced embroideries, you see them usually working on transparent silk. So this gives you an impression of how difficult it is to um, produce something like this. And you have to take our word for it, but if we would turn it around, you would see the same image.
So here are some textiles that are non-official, not court robes, but still extremely beautiful. And I think I put a detail in so that we could discuss the other major decoration type you see in textiles, not embroidery, but something called kese.
Yeah, this is such an interesting textile, very delicate because it combines um, very skillful stitching in the details you will see later, and here a very skillful type of tapestry weaving. Tapestry weaving with wool is one art that you know from European tapestries, I assume. But when you look at tapestry weaving with silk, and the fineness of the silk thread, then you can imagine how delicate this work had to be done. So, what is kose? It's cut silk, and it actually indicates that pictorial weaving has been completed, and to weave a picture, something that is not determined by the pixelation of one warp, one weft thread, but tries to imitate round shapes as they appear in nature, the weaver always had to make sure that the fields he wanted to fill with color, or she wanted to fill with color, were different and distinct from the background. Nevertheless, they couldn't risk that while just weaving on one particular spot with color, it would have caused a slit and between the background and the color field. And so to avoid that the garment or the fabric loosens, you can see where Anne Rose kindly indicates with the cursor that there are a few white threads reaching into the colored field, and that gives the fabric stability. So it's almost imperceptible to the eye if you don't go as closely um, to the garment as we can do this with a camera here, thanks to the photographer of the JSMA.
So this robe just has infinite exciting details, including not just the kese, but a little bit of augmentation with painting. I believe that the antenna of the butterflies here were actually painted in. That would be too fine to do with kosa. And also this fabulous applique of these ribbons done in these fabulous shapes.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece. The ribbons, the cutout in the shape of the color is just amazing.
Another robe, now we've switched back to embroidery, has the hallowed theme of 100 children. So, an auspicious theme intended to invoke prosperity, fecundity, longevity. And the details of this are also amazing. It's hard to imagine the capability of creating such character within these very restrictive technological means, and yet the artists have done it.
Embroiderers were really skilled in imitating painting. They didn't they this art doesn't stand behind painting, and they wanted to create as lively an impression as they could have done it with a brush.
So another work in the same gallery rotation, also in the theme of 100 children. This combines embroidery and couching, and you can see some of the charming details of the children who are playing at more adult activities, but you can also see the beautiful colors and the couching that's used to bound the rocks in gold, some of the clothing, the collars, and even some of the children wear delicate bracelets. So other interesting sericulture related works that we were able to put out in the gallery.
Yeah, this is wonderful to have sort of the two pillars of the wealth of China, the way the emperors saw the distribution of work, A, for tax income, but B, also for the flourishing of the people. The two pillars are sericulture, the production of silk, here shown uh, from an album that actually follows sericulture from the beginning steps of collecting mulberry leaves to feed the silkworms, all the way to the production of the actual fabric. So here you see the dyeing of the silk, the drying of the strands of silk, and then a loom on which the silk is woven into a fabric. These This kind of album was produced for export in watercolors, and there were workshops, especially in Guangzhou, that tried to document not only sericulture and agriculture, the two um, pillars of wealth and abundance, but also other production production series, such as, for instance, a glass workshop. This is the series about or this is from a manual that shows rice cultivation, the part of agriculture associated with the work of men, and whereas sericulture is always associated with the work of women, and was um, commissioned during the Kangxi period.
So Professor Asim has spent a great deal of time studying our textile collection and our founder, Gertrude Bess Warner's fascination with textiles. And this came to fruition in a really wonderful digital exhibition that was funded through a Mellon Foundation grant. And here's the website. So if you want to learn more about Gertrude Bess Warner's involvement with textiles and see glorious details with technical explanations of them, please go to this website. Moving on to three-dimensional objects, we have some wonderful sculptures.
This is a beautiful rock carving. Some of you may know it. It usually was in the treasure wall that you see behind Anne Rose, and she graciously allowed it to be taken out and put into its own case so that you can see not only the front but also the back side. So on the right side, you see the Queen Mother of the West in her palace in the paradisical Kunlun Mountains, and she observes two children, a jade maiden and a gold boy, in a basin holding up a disc that symbolizes the complementary forces of yin and yang. And on the left side, you see what used to be sort of the back of the rock. Now you don't have to decide which is front, which is back. This one, this side is also associated with Taoism, and it shows the emergence of a mythical animal from the river and is associated with prognostication. It carries on its back also a disc with trigrams that are coming from the eating, which of course combines these trigrams into hexagrams and was used to link the actions of men with the processes of the cosmos. So here the mythical beast appears carrying this um, skill, this diagram to help people orient them in their lives and to connect their own life with the forces of the cosmos.
So one of the most beloved icons in the museum's collection is this 9-foot tall jade pagoda. And as I mentioned before, there is an association with a number of Qing dynasty emperors. And it is alleged that this pagoda was actually created as a gift from the Emperor Kangxi to his son, the Emperor Yongzheng, whose calligraphy we just admired, at the point in time when his designated heir, the emperor, the person who would eventually become Emperor Qianlong, was born. Um, this pagoda is astonishing. It is created as an actual work of architecture with pieces of jade. And so here you can see a sort of medium distance detail of it, giving you a sense of the roof structure with these beautiful finials along the edges and the structures of all of those balconies and pillars. And here you can see a closer detail in which you can make out one of the Buddhist figures seated inside of this structure. It's an astonishing tour de force. And it came to the collection not from Gertrude Bess Warner, but from an international polo player named Winston Guest, who had no previous association with the University of Oregon. So I think we like to believe that it was a more common knowledge of Gertrude Bess Warner's fascination with China that had the gravitational pull to bring this fabulous object to us. And it has now become a major icon of the museum, as you see find Professor Asim in her digital background. We also have one monumental seated Buddha. This is the Buddha Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. And this is from the Jin dynasty. It is juxtaposed with a contemporary work of art that certainly references the idea of Buddhist sculpture, but is also, I think, a little bit of a humorous critique. So this work of art by the Taiwanese-born artist Chen Longbin is entitled Sotheby's Buddha. And when you see it from the front, it looks like a fragment from a Buddhist sculpture. But in fact, when you look at the back, you realize that the artist has piled a number of high-end auction catalogs and then sculpted them, made that into the medium of this sculpture. And one cannot help but feel that this is something of a critique of the sale of religious and cultural patrimony. Here's a detail at the back where you can make out the Sotheby's and Christie's titles and dates of some of these catalogs. I had mentioned that our new casework makes it possible for the first time to display and for audiences to appreciate some of the wonderful works in our collection. And so we'll look at a few of them here, including this wonderful image of the Medicine Buddha with bodhisattvas of the sun and moon and 12 guardian generals, which is a Ming dynasty painting that is done in the dynasty before the Qing, dated to 1477, but in fact has Qing dynasty inventory seals on the surface. This is such an exquisite painting, so beautifully painted using rarefied materials, malachite and azurite, as well as gold, and just the refinement of the figures. It's just an incredibly moving work of art. We also have an auspicious painting showing entitled "Living a Long Life as Pine Trees and Cranes," two beings associated with longevity in China. And Gertrude Bess Warner acquired this painting with the hope that it was a Song Dynasty painting, which, alas, it is not. But what is nice is that it is one of the best Ming Dynasty examples of its type, and one of Professor Asim's favorite works of art that I'll let her explain.
This shows the return of Tao Yuanming, the famous poet who was fed up with serving a government that didn't really pay attention to um, his advice. And so we see him here returning home. The servants are unloading the boat from all the books that he has collected. And as he approaches the gate in the background that leads to his residence, all the neighbors and workers who work on the estate come and greet him. Tao Yuanming's poetry is also associated with Taoist ideals, and you see that he looks dignified but also very modest and greets the people who come to greet him, including these little children, one of whom is about to lose his pants as he kneels down to greet the master coming home.
Another work that has not seen the light of day in our galleries for many, many years is this wonderful landscape by Lun Ying, which was recently discovered in storage and which we're delighted to present to the public for the first time. So here you can see some scholars seated at the base of this rushing waterfall and stream in this windswept landscape.
This is a wonderful example of one filial son, and it comes from a series of 24 paragons of filial piety, a set of stories that are written and illustrated to inspire young people to care for their elders and to honor them. So the story here shows that Umang, the young man who you see sleeping on his bed, um, had spent the night next to the bed of his parents, and he took off his shirt so that the mosquitoes in the summer heat, in the hot summer night, wouldn't attack his parents but him. And he did this every night, and only when once very exhausted usually he got back up and went to his own bed, and usually he did this so that his parents didn't notice. But on this particular day, his father gets up and walks past the bed of the son and realizes that the son forgot to put back on his shirt, so that he sees and immediately understands what has happened when he sees the bite marks of the mosquitoes covering his son's body. So he understands immediately that it was the sacrifice of the son that kept him and his wife free from mosquitoes and in deep sleep.
So, given the period of activity and collecting priorities of Gertrude Bess Warner, it's not surprising that the strength of her collection is concentrated in the late imperial period, before the fall of the Qing. Happily, the solid foundation she established has been enhanced by a number of individual acquisitions, two recent major donations, and a few strategic loans that address UO's teaching priorities and extend the museum's narrative content to the present. So what I'm showing here is the corner that has three works of art from the 20th and 21st century. The first of them is a hanging scroll, a set of four hanging scrolls with a landscape called Homecoming in the Snow from 1995 by the Chinese-born American artist Zhu Yisheng. So Zhu Yisheng, as a young man in China, walked the breadth of the nation in his efforts to, well, first fighting against Japanese forces during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but then he wanted to go to school and he knew that he had to basically get to the other side of China. And so he walked in the winter. And at a certain point, he was so cold, so hungry, and in such despair, feeling so lost, that he was about to give up and just lay down and die. At which point he saw a light in the distance and took the chance and walked towards it. And thankfully, the people inside of that building took him in and gave him food, let him rest, and he was able to continue on with his journey. He has encapsulated this really frightening, bitter experience into a literati style landscape. And it is quite beautiful, but the inscription on it speaks of the thing that still haunts his dreams of how frightening this was. And here you can see details of the figures with feet wrapped in rags and the gate to which they were approaching. He was, in fact, alone, but he has made it into a composition with two figures. So a strategic loan that represents some of the work that we've been doing at the museum comes from a local private collection that has over 450 Chinese propaganda posters. And this is one of the grandest. We rely on the helmsman to sail the sea, a portrait of Mao Zedong, surrounded by a sea of red flags and a number of landscape monuments that reflect different moments in his life. This has really allowed us to work with students to deal with original objects, to delve into history, and to work with a number of faculty members on a couple of exhibitions. And this type of work of art was created by a number of artists, including Hong Liu. So Liu Hong, using her Chinese ordered name, is one of the great benefactors to our museum. And in fact, we'll look at a couple of her works. So next to, in fact, between Zhu Yisheng's painting and the propaganda poster, we have Liu Hong's devastating image of women in the war, comfort women, also reflecting the Second Sino-Japanese War, when women across Asia were forced into sexual servitude to Japanese soldiers. And as she does in so much of her art, much of it based on historic photographs, she manages to lift up figures who otherwise would not be heard from in history, to impart dignity upon them. And I think you can look across the faces of these women and see all different levels of fear and anger and despair. And yet, somehow, by lionizing them in this way, commemorating them, she has imparted dignity. Somehow their voices are being heard by history. There are two works in the gallery by Liu Hong, this one and the one called Imperial Column, which is actually displayed near the Chinese pagoda at the other end of the gallery. This too is based on historic photographs, in this case, an early 20th century photograph showing a man embracing a large pillar in one of the buildings at the Forbidden City, in the Imperial Palace. But it's not just a strict rendition of that photograph. It has an overlay of sort of Buddhist heaven, in that there are these flying figures called apsaras, kind of angelic, fairy-like figures that you see in Buddhist paintings. In this case, these are derived from Buddhist cave temples at Dunhuang, which Liu Hong had studied in person and used as the basis for some of her earlier works of art. And in fact, we position this work of art near our Ming Dynasty Buddhist painting. And it seems almost as if some of the apsaras in the sky above the Ming Dynasty painting have flown into the airspace of Liu Hong's moving work of art. We're so thrilled that this legacy gift from Liu Hong of these mixed media works that combine aspects of painting and printmaking are going to be the focus of a special exhibition at the museum in May of 2021. So please be looking for that in the future. The other major donation that is going to culminate in a special exhibition comes from California collectors Jack and Susie Wadsworth. In the past, they had donated a large collection of contemporary Japanese prints, but more recently, they have very generously donated a large collection of contemporary Chinese photographs. And there are just a couple in the current Chinese rotation. This one, the notorious Dialogue Shooting by Xiao Lu, in which the artist is seen pulling out a gun and shooting into her own art installation at the opening of the China Avant-Garde exhibition in February of 1989. Having done this surprising and kind of frightening act, she was immediately arrested and taken away by the police. But very soon thereafter, there were demonstrations in Tiananmen, and in some ways, she was seen as like making the first shots of a kind of revolutionary demonstration. Now, I believe she's based now in Beijing, but
yeah, she went to Australia actually for a while, and then she returned first to Hangzhou, and now she lives in Beijing and is still engaging in performance art.
yeah, but even the original work of art was somewhat transgressive in that it seems to speak towards difficulty communicating between men and women. You have a woman in one telephone booth and a man in another with the phone off the hook in between. Other works of art from the Wadsworth collection that are currently on view are 4 from a selection of 15 from the Here or There portfolio by Lin Jianmao and Wang Gongxin. Spooky, otherworldly images of women wearing very strange and yet in some ways very beautiful clothing in these apocalyptic landscapes. So thank you for coming through this tour of the Myriad Treasures exhibition with Professor Asim and with me. We're thrilled to be able to present these works of art to you in this way and to have the gallery space and the casework to be able to do multiple rotations from our large and distinguished Chinese collection in the future. Unless Professor Asim has anything that she wants to add, I'd like to thank her very much for participating in this tour. And then we can proceed on to the minute exhibit, which is just a very short video showing some of the works of art that we have just seen in this tour. Thank you.
Thank you. And hopefully everybody will be able to see these wonderful new displays live at the shortest possible option, and we'll see what you and the museum staff have done to really bring out the beauty of objects of art that previously could not have been shown in this quality and in this grandeur that they really have. So thank you for all the work that went into redesigning the Chinese gallery.
Well, of course, it's our pleasure. I should mention that our Chinese gallery rotation is the feature of the current issue of Orientations magazines, that is the November-December 2020 issue, and that you can see a detail of our treasure wall on the cover and a 12-page article within it. And of course, as an academic art museum, the reason why we do these rotations is not just for the general public, but of course for use in teaching for the University of Oregon. So it's our privilege to do this, and we hope that Gertrude Best-Warner and other benefactors are pleased with the work that we have done. So thank you very much, and I will switch over to the video.
Jordan's Nature 艺术博物馆的宋人中国艺术展厅适才完成了让大家期待已久的翻新工程。此项工程受到了来自 Betty 宋人和其他匿名人士的慷慨捐助。这里的开幕展览代表性地陈列了横跨4000年的中国历史，它们包括来自本馆创立人 Gertrude Best-Warner 女士的遗赠藏品，以及令人欢欣的心得收藏。其中包含陶瓷器、青铜器、绘画、版画、书法作品、织绣品、装饰品和现当代中国艺术。本次展厅翻新一方面总结庆贺了俄勒冈大学在过去1个世纪在跨文化交流方面所做出的成就，另一方面为师生们对于本馆不断丰富的中国藏品的研究打造了锦绣的未来。